Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to this week's subscriber Q&A. I just in the middle of shooting an upcoming video, so this is going to be a very well-lit Q&A. I got all my setup and everything, and maybe I'll turn the camera around at some point so you can see the craziness that is my apartment at the moment. But hopefully I'll have a higher quality 4K video up for you next week. It's really what I've been aiming for and working my butt off on. But for now, let's jump into the Q&As. First up, Derek Hoffman asked if I've ever reviewed the MCE to VGA or if there's a review in the works. To be honest, I've never heard of it before. I guess, is that a CGA graphics to VGA converter? I guess it said with scanline emulator. It seems pretty neat. It seems like something that would be great for those old PC computers, that like the Tandy 1000 that I used to have or something, but no, I've never even really seen one before. So if you know anybody that has one, or especially anyone around the New York City area, maybe I can go take a look, but I had no plans. It does seem pretty cool though. So yeah, let me know. James Russell asked how I get audio when using HD SDI converters. And I believe we're using the same one, that cheap one that you can get on eBay or Amazon that's HDMI in, and one BNC HD SDI connector going out. So many acronyms. So with that connector, I split the audio beforehand. Sometimes it's a Blu-ray player with separate optical audio, or even maybe like, certain consoles where you could output HDMI and then just get audio from the analog port. I've done it that way before, but I found that using an HDMI splitter that breaks out audio as well is a pretty big help. Both because it separates the audio for you. The one I use has optical and regular RCA output, which is pretty awesome. But I've had a lot of issues with that converter, and not because the quality's bad, excuse me, but the BNC connector breaks right off. So what I've ended up having to do is, it broke. I had to desolder the BNC connector from the board, and then I solder in a pigtail adapter directly to it. And then I tie it off on the inside before the metal, so that when you pull on it, that's strain relief. It's hitting the inside of the metal case and not pulling on the board. So having that splitter hooked up was a big help, because I was able to just say, hey, let me grab my, my flat screen monitor real quick, plug it in, and make sure this is working. So that might just be the best overall thing for you. You can get, I think HD SDI passes audio as well, but then you're going to need another splitting device on the other end, so you might as well just spend less money on the HDMI splitter. But that's how I do it, and I think that's that's probably the easiest way for everybody. And it looks like a few people had commented as well, but that's, I don't think anybody had the perfect solution, so I'd suggest that one. Firebrand X responded in regards to the Xbox profiles for the Framemeister, and he said he hadn't messed with them in a long time, but he had some suggestions on how you can go into the color menu and set the saturation down to about 24 and the brightness to 36, and that might help level the brightness. That's one of those things that I did want to mention as well, is Firebrand X has at least one, but I think more videos that show how he does these things. So I think he has one definitely for the OSSC. I don't remember if he had one for the Framemeister, but I would check those out, because, for most of us, on average, we just want the profile to work, but occasionally learning how those conclusions were reached is incredibly helpful. So maybe that's just the best bet, is check out that video and then see if we can have a newly tweaked Xbox profile from it. Mitch Bowling had a pretty interesting question regarding his Sony BVM. So he has 3 RGB monitors, 2 Sony PVMs and 1 BVM, and predominantly uses the PVMs. The BVM he has is a 14H1U, which is I think that's a 900 line monitor, maybe an 800 or 900 line monitor that goes up to 1080i. And I used to own one. Wes from Second Opinion Games now owns it. Mine was freaking awesome. And he said that he's grown to appreciate the OSSC's handling of 480p, and predominantly uses 480p on flat screens, and then uses 240p and 480i on his 20-inch PVMs, and hasn't really been using the 14-inch BVM a lot. So the statement was, am I doing it a disservice by having it not plugged in or ever being used? I don't see the need to run 720p content on a 14-inch screen. So I mean, the direct, strong opinion, the short answer to that is as long as you're taking good care of the monitor and it's not eventually going to get thrown out, then no, it's not a disservice. The only time I would ever shame someone is if they were leaving it in their outside in the rain or something like that. But the other side of that is, you know, this is all preference based. I know Wes loves running 720p content on that 14-inch BVM. Occasionally I'll get weird pictures from him that's like him playing a newer game on it. But it's funny, as much as I love CRTs and as much as I talk nonstop about them, the most that I use the HD support for is my testing. And if I didn't do testing at all, if, you know, I sold Retro RGB for $1 billion and was just, you know, sitting on a boat somewhere, I would occasionally use 480p for some of the different things. There's some cool Dreamcast 480p games, but I would use the high definition mode of the monitor that I would use most would be widescreen 480p on the BVM D32 and not the 720p. And here's why. I found that a lot of movies, even ones that are released on Blu-ray, were designed, you know, especially older movies, were designed to be watched either on a crappy CRT of, you know, the crappy consumer grades of the time, or a big projection screen like you'd find on a movie theater. And even people who could afford insane, you know, high-end projectors back in the day, you're still not going to notice film grain and any of the I guess, you know, I call it distortion. Scott would backhand me if he was here. Scott would say, you know, it's part of the look. It's part of the, you know, how the warmth of the films. But what I found was that a lot of those movies, even on Blu-ray, like Das Boot and stuff like that, watching them on my OLED's very cool. But watching them in 480p, so progressive, not interlaced, but in widescreen on the BVM is perfect. Because the scan lines, in my opinion at least, cut through that noise in the film grain, and it really makes it feel like I'm just watching a movie. I'm not really seeing any interference on it. So, you know, a lot of people would really hate me for saying that and wonder why I don't play, you know, Switch and Wii U and all those things in 720p on it. But the truth is, the BVM that you have and the one that I have, I think in 720p looks so good that it pretty much just looks like a flat screen. So I would not get rid of it unless you were to trade it for something else that would be more of a use for you personally. I think for you, maybe having that monitor or trading that monitor for a really large, you know, maybe not a consumer grade, but or maybe an RGB mounted consumer grade TV might be better. Because if you're, you know, if you're not going to utilize it for its extra features, maybe just keep your ears open and see if you know of a good modder that would trade you like a 32 or 36-inch TV that's been RGB modded for that one. That way you can get, you know, kick-ass light gun games on a huge tube. Just, you know, a good modder that's done it right. Otherwise, it's nowhere near worth as much as the BVM. But, you know, if somebody's taking the time, like I will be doing a video soon on a JVC D32, so not the Sony BVM, it's a consumer grade JVC, and I'm going to be doing a full recap, which takes forever. Then I'm going to be doing an RGB mod, and then I'm going to see what kind of tweaking I can do to it. So somebody that would go through, excuse me, still sick, through that much trouble, that would be a worthy trade. But no, as long as you're not destroying the monitor, absolutely not being a disservice, there's no harm in collecting stuff like that, as long as, in my opinion, you're also trying to keep them alive as well, you know, preservation and all that. So I just, I think that I agree with you in most cases, in that I really love a lot of 480p content through the OSSC on my flat screen. And with a few exceptions, I predominantly use my monitors for 240p content. So no, don't disagree with you at all. Kester Weeks was asking about RGB modding the core graphics or RGB modding the Tenuki bank that plugs into the back of it. So I believe that's the IFU module as well. I could be wrong. I don't know too much about all the accessories, but One of the things that that Voltar had tested was installing his board in the, I think it was the IFU module, but basically he said it worked fine, but it's not going to be as good as the internal mod. So as long as your overall solution would still work with an internal RGB mod, then that might be the best way to go about doing it. If you planned on using something like the SSD S3, you'd have to take into account that you'd have to get audio from that and then video from the core graphics. So maybe it would be best to just use that. But overall, you can get a kit from Retro Access that includes high quality cable and a new DIN connector. And then you just desolder the DIN from your core graphics, solder in the new one a special way. I believe you have to bend 1 or 2 pins up. But basically, it replaces the original DIN, allowing for this to be a no-cut mod, and that way you could just have a perfect RGB signal from your core graphics. One other thing to note is if you're going to pull it apart anyway, you might as well do the cap replacement because it's less than $10 for the kit, and there aren't too many capacitors. And while you're doing that, make sure to do the jail bar fix as well. So it's going to turn into a project, but at the end of the day, you could end up with a no-cut RGB modded core graphics that outputs the perfect signal. And I actually have a video coming out next month that shows exactly that. Let's see if I can get this to focus. But I have Voltar's board, just like the one that you asked about, and I will be putting that inside my core graphics as well as going over some other PC Engine stuff. So yeah, it's probably a month away though, but hope that answered the question. Elmer M asked, with the Game Boy Advance consoleizer now public, is this a better, quicker, and easier way of playing Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games than on a GameCube, buying an Action Replay and getting Swiss to boot? It's up to you. If you don't own any of those things, I would say get the Game Boy Advance consoleizer, especially if you could find them pre-installed for a decent price, or if you enjoy modding yourself. It's not that bad. It's certainly not as, I would say it's definitely easier than like an Ultra HDMI kit, but not as easy as a SNES Mini RGB mod. So yeah, I would say go for that. But if you already owned a GameCube and an Action Replay and some kind of way to get RGB or HDMI out, and got the SD loader, or the SD reader, if you got all that stuff already, it's a tough one. I don't know. I guess if you're only playing via HDMI and you don't use the GameCube for anything else, then yeah, stick with the Game Boy Advance consoleizer. But I think there's a large number of people that, even if they predominantly use their GameCube for the Game Boy interface software, it's still something that they use, and this allows for both RGB and HDMI output, especially if you have like the new Eon adapter. So I'd really just leave that one up to you. And yeah, it was, excuse me, absolutely sorry, still sick. Absolutely awesome running into you at Brooklyn Video Games and meeting you. Anybody ever sees me, definitely come over and say hello, because I always love meeting everybody and talking shop. I think you caught me right as I was running out the door that day, and if you had come a little bit earlier, we were just hanging out, playing Neo Geo and talking shop. So great to meet you, and I hope to see you down there again. Kelly Greenidge asked what kind of camera I use for my videos. And I've wanted to make a video about this for months now. I gotta be sticking with the retro gaming stuff, but at least for the short term. But I use a Sony a6300 with a prime 35mm lens, and I really pride myself in the fact that there are so many YouTube videos out there about, how to make a podcast, how to start a good YouTube channel, and they all conclude that you need $5 grand worth of stuff. And it's just not true, and I hope that this is a good proof of that. If you don't need a direct lapel mic input or boom mic input into the camera, and in most situations you will not, to be honest, you could get the Sony a6000. So there's a few things that it doesn't do. It won't do 4K. It doesn't have as good of the autofocus, and once again, no microphone input. But it's still a great mirrorless camera, and you could use that same Sony lens. And excuse me, that's really what the combination of those is what gets this higher quality picture. And depending on what type of things you like to shoot, I have my camera mounted behind my monitor, and I have an HDMI cable going into my Datapath Vision, and that way I could use OBS to do these recordings. And you have to add a little bit of delay to OBS, just do the clap test and then play it back in slow motion, and then you could line up where everything is. I think it's 80 milliseconds lag is what I have mine set to. But I think it is, you know, for under $1,000, definitely, you would be able to get a setup going where you could have a decent video and decent audio. I also use for the professional videos or for the interviews, I use these Tascam DR5s, DR05. They're not intuitive. The manual sucks. That's another thing I wanted to show in the video. So let's see if I can get this on camera in case you're interested. But I don't use this built-in. I use the microphone input up here. And then when you start it up, you have to first hit record. That puts it in standby mode, and then you could see this going. Then after that, you need to get, where am I here? See how it says input level? I set mine to about 65. And then when you do that, then hit record a second time, and then that's what sets the audio level. If you read the manual for this thing, it is completely opposite, and on top of that, I have a second one of these that you have to set that audio every time. Same firmware, same everything, but this one saved it and the other one didn't. So they're great, but with the audio, you know, the volume shortcomings aside, and that's all you would really need if you wanted to make decent videos and with good audio in them. And then you would just do audio-video sync with something like Premiere. And I've had excellent, excellent luck. Just make sure, you know, hit record on the camera, record on the audio recorder, close to about the same time, just to make it easier. And then one loud clap. And I always do it in front of the camera. So Premiere almost always lines that up perfectly. And then you could just delete the camera audio track. But for whatever reason, if it doesn't, you could always just line up where your hands hit in the clap. Just line that up manually. So I don't know if you wanted that detail of an answer. I guess the short answer is a 6300 mirrorless with a 35mm prime lens. But I do want to dig into this and do a really fun, detailed video, because I just think, I mean, every single video I ever watched about how to improve the quality of your YouTube videos ended in $5 grand. And it's just bullshit. It's not true at all. Some good tricks, buying some used equipment, under $1 grand, you can have a really great setup that's 1080p 60. You can't quite do that for 4K yet, at least not in 60 frames per second, but at least 1080p would be good. Slash Bunny had some great questions about the Datapath Vision capture card. I'm going to go bottom to top because it's easier to answer that way. Regardless of the input source, is it viable to play games captured on your PC monitor, or is there too much lag? If you've ever seen any of the footage from some of my videos where I capture and play at the same time, I die on like the first level of Super Mario Brothers. So for me, there is way too much lag, but who knows? Maybe with a faster computer, you could change it. But at least on my setup in i7 that's 6 years old or something like that, too much lag. When capturing an HDMI signal, it appears you could use a typical HDMI to DVI adapter. Yes, but get a good quality one, because if you're going 1080p 60, you'll get speckles on the screen, or even sometimes a weird green thing. And most of the time that's because of a crappy dongle or adapter. Sometimes it could be that the bus on your motherboard isn't fast enough for 1080p 60. But make sure that adapter is good. But your actual question was, how do you extract the audio? So I usually use the same View HD splitter, because it pulls both optical and analog audio, and it splits the signal. So it seems to works well for me. But for whatever reason, the testing and the video capture that I've been doing, I didn't require super high-end audio. So I just have it going right into the 3.5mm input of my computer, but there is a hum, like a very noticeable hum. So I would never use that for like it would be okay for streaming, I think, but certainly not for audio comparisons. Firebrand X recommended an optical audio capture device that he uses and works great for him. I bought the same one, granted about a year later, and it didn't work at all for me. So I assume it's one of those generic Chinese manufacturers that has the same outer case but different guts, so you could probably buy 10 of the same ones and get different insides. So I don't really know. I used to have a Focusrite box that did optical audio input, but that was really designed for musical instruments, so I ran into some hiccups. So if anybody could recommend a decent, USB 3 would be nice, but if it's an internal card, that's fine too. But a decent audio capture device. I think Steve from HD Retrovision talked about one, but I haven't tested it yet. Now that I think about it, I really should go back and see what I could do. But yeah, that's what I would do, is just use an HDMI, either an HDMI audio breakout or an HDMI splitter. And that might actually even make the chain a little easier depending on what your setup's like. So you could just go HDMI into this, either the splitter or the audio breakout, and then just buy a shorter HDMI to DVI cable and not an adapter. And that way you could, you'd have more of a chance of getting a higher end cable. And that would solve the need for worrying about, is your HDMI to DVI dongle good enough? And lastly, you asked, if all of the consoles are set up for SCART, how do people typically connect them to the Datapath Vision? So this is something that I've been working on with Voltar. He got distracted and forgot about the project for a while, and then so did I, because I got tired of bugging him. But then it started to become way more relevant again, so I have it right here. Basically, he has an adapter where you could go SCART input, or VGA, or component, and then it just goes out from the DVI connector directly to the Datapath. And it does break out audio here as well with a 3.5mm adapter. But this requires a few things. This prototype has a sync stripper built in. That works great. You will need a sync stripper, so it can't. I'm 99.9% sure that you can't put composite video or Luma, and I'm 100% sure that in most cases it has to be the higher TTL level. It won't use 75 ohm C-Sync, which is what SCART devices would be. So using something like a sync strike would absolutely work. Using an Extron crosspoint, excuse me, an Extron RGB device or a crosspoint might work as well. But the biggest problem with all of those solutions is there's no low-pass filter. And anytime you're taking an analog signal and putting it into a digital device, there has to be some kind of filtering, or you're just going to get a ton of noise on there. So this prototype does not have one, but the next revision should. In fact, I plan on hacking this into this. I might make another video about that, but we're working on the issue. When I say we, Zach's working on the issue, and I'm working on testing it and making sure he doesn't miss anything. But that will be the end-all, be-all for Datapath capture, because you have the correct voltage on the sync line, you have the correct filtering on the analog RGB lines going in, and you'd be able to take any of the signals that it takes and capture it directly. So that's the full rundown on it. If you have a board, so if you have pretty much any of Voltar's boards that are made in the past year and a half, 2 years, or Renee's triple bypass, those have low-pass filter toggles on them. So in that case, you could just use a sync strike. Just turn on the filtering on those mod boards, like the SNES RGB or the triple bypass, and then put that through a sync strike, and you're right there. That's exactly where you need to be, and it'll work perfect. Just make sure to get the software side right. Check out Dark Aries Wiki and the different software that you have out there. I talked about that in the podcast a few weeks ago. So the software side has to line up, or else it's just not going to work correctly. But yeah, so you're just going to make sure to have all of the right hardware going in. Bad Reality asked a question, and I'm not quite sure I understand it, but I think it's basically, do I prefer RGB output or HDMI out from retro consoles? And I mean, it's a pretty straightforward answer. When I'm playing on a flat screen TV, I would always rather use the HDMI mod. Direct digital to digital is going to get as perfect a signal as possible. For me, as long as the FPGA core is accurate, like Kevtris's has been, doesn't really matter if it's original or not. So for example, the high-def NES kit versus the Analog NT Mini, don't care. It's the same to me, both equally as awesome. I'm not usually a fan of scan lines on flat screen TVs. I used to mess with it a lot, but on flat screens, to me personally, it just looks like a bunch of lines drawn across the screen. Whereas on a CRT, there's a depth there. Because technically you are looking through glass, you know, through that CRT to the back. So there is sort of kind of a depth thing going on. And there's also the vertical scan lines that cut through. So until we could properly mimic those, which I was told it's minimum of a 4K scaler for TV lines, and it might be 8K before you could truly mimic a BVM, if at all. So that's pretty far away. So I've just chosen, in most cases, to just enjoy the artwork and play games on a flat screen like that. The only exception might be the Woozle's Game Boy Advance HDMI consolizer, because the vertical and horizontal scan lines are pretty darn cool. That really does kind of give it a feel of an LCD handheld screen. And those are accurately emulated because there is no depth to the LCD on a handheld. It is essentially you're just looking at the individual pixels. For the other questions, though, when I do play N64, I do prefer to play it on a CRT with the anti-aliasing stuff on. Like all of the de-blur stuff turned on. I'm not a fan of the look of that. It always kind of weirded me out and it just wasn't for me. But that's preference. It's not a right or wrong way to do it. So basically, you know, if I'm going to sit down and play a game, if it's one of the rare moments where I have more than 20 minutes to kill and I'm going to actually play a retro game, there's almost no chance that I'll play it on a flat screen. Unless I'm trying out something new, you know, whatever it is. But, you know, to sit there and game on it, I'm going to pull out either my BVM or my PVM, take the original RGBS modded console and play it that way. Hopefully through a stereo if the time of the day allows for that. I'm not saying I don't enjoy on a flat screen. I don't take it for granted that I was lucky enough to stumble across some of the best monitors that you could possibly get. So I just use them and appreciate the heck out of them. Also, you know, for the newer consoles, like GameCube and the Wii, most of those games to me look like modern games, and I really love the way they look on a flat screen. So, you know, even Dreamcast to a point. If it's not one of the fighting games I used to play, all of those things I'd rather use the HDMI mods on a flat screen, because those don't feel retro to me. Those still have the 3D newer look. So yeah, but all of this stuff is just preference, really. I would just do whatever your eyes prefer. I've had some people over the years have a Sony PVM and sell it after they got the OSSC. They said they never used it anymore. Everything was just so much cooler for them on their big old flat screen, and they didn't need it. And there's nothing wrong with that. So as long as you don't throw the PVM out, make sure it goes in the right hands. And don't get on eBay and be a scalper either. There was somebody selling Ikegamis for $600 last year that is now selling them for $1,500. And I was told they all have bad caps, like leaking on the board caps. Don't be that guy. But yeah, it's a good question. It's just you know, it's just something that's all preference, really. You know, if it's going to be on a digital screen, use the digital output, analog screen, analog output. And if it works on both, do what your eyes prefer. Chris Larson wanted to know if anybody's keeping a database of re-releases of games that are either ports or emulation. And I don't know of anybody, but I think that's something that's really important that I hope somebody is working on. Because whenever an older game is re-released through an emulator on a new console, sometimes it adds a lot of cool stuff. Sometimes it's great, but lag is always added. And sometimes it just sucks. It's just you might as well emulate it on a Raspberry Pi. Whereas a lot of the ports that I've seen over the years, excuse me, have been great. Some of those have been terrible too. I believe Sonic for Game Boy Advance is notorious as being one of the worst ports ever, whereas some of the emulated versions of Sonic 1 are absolutely great. The Christian Whitehead version, stuff like that, you know. But I think that's a database that's really important, and I think a lot of people would appreciate that. So if anybody knows of one, please let me know. Chris Larson also asked if I'm going to any conventions soon. I don't know. I've been talking to different people about trying to get me out to some of these. I was asked I was asked casually if I wanted to go to any of them and speak, and I always say yes, but then I forget to follow up. I'm not a salesman at heart. I'm not one of, like, I could never be one of those cold calling people. It's not me. So I've talked to some people about potentially having other people handle that stuff, because I've always found out after the fact that I've missed good opportunities that I could have been invited to. So yeah, I talked to one manager style person last week who sounded great. So hopefully I can get out to more of these, but I don't have any plans at the moment. I wish I could. And on top of that, I wish I could bring more to the table at these. Like, I love doing the Q&As. I would, you know, I even like these Q&As, but you know, the one that we did that I thought was awesome is when we brought a setup of 3 identical monitors, one with composite, one with S-Video, and one with RGB, and I customized the SNES to output all 3 at the same time, and we kind of had it to the over to the corner. It was the first time I did a panel with HD Retrovision, so I guess that was the origin story of the Retro Roundtable. And people, once they realized what it was, people went nuts. And I would love to do more things like that. I can't do that, just me. I can't bring 3 CRTs and armfuls of stuff when it's just me carrying them. So, you know, short answer to your question, I have no solid plans to go to any, but I wish I could go to all of them. And I wish I could bring some cool stuff to it to really show off why some of the stuff I do is, at least in my opinion, important, and how you could do these things easily. The GOAT has a good question. He's planning on buying a Neo Geo sometime in 2019 and is trying to decide between an AES, a pre-consoleized MVS, or a bare MVS, which he would then consolize himself. So I have some opinions on this, but keep in mind they're just opinions, and you know, not knowing your full scenario, maybe this won't apply to you, but if you already have a good super gun like the Hass or the Sentinel, you know, just picking up an MVS and using it through that should be a perfectly good solution, and you don't really have to worry about consolizing. The only consolization would then be whatever case that you use. I've been using the Hass lately. I'm going to get to a video on it, but I'm going to take my time because that thing's awesome, and I refuse to rush out a video. I want to just do a really high quality video on that and playing arcade games on monitors, like home personal monitors. So if you already own that equipment, I would say go for that one, just because the original games are cheaper. You know, and you could get both the Darksoft or the Neo SD ROM cart right away for it. If you don't have any desire to have any kind of supergun setup, buying an AES is going to end up with a good solution. And then if you wanted to make it the best, excuse me, the best solution, there's a few mods you can do, both ranging from the easier side to super complicated but amazing. That one's not out yet, but you know, the potential for that is pretty incredible. And right out of the box, it's going to be a good, solid solution that you can just buy a cable and plug it in, and then decide how much crazier you want to get from there. Pre-consolized MVS consoles, there are more shitty ones than there are not. And when I paused before I said that because I wanted to make sure, like, am I just mouthing off without thinking? But double and triple checking in my head right now. I've seen some beautifully manufactured cases. I've seen some setups that make it look like an AES, that when you look at it, it looks like a piece of art. And you open it up, and not only does it look like shit, it spits out the wrong level voltages. Some not to the point where it would hurt your equipment, but definitely to that you're not going to get the greatest image out of it. So pre-consolized MVSs, unless you know for a fact that one is very well made and outputs the proper levels, and other people that you know and trust have bought it and taken it apart to review it, I would stay away from those unless you knew for sure that you were spending your money on something worth buying. Because if not, you're just kind of throwing your money away. The only one that I thought was kind of cool is that CMVS from AliExpress, simply because of how cheap it is. And even that one's not quite built correctly, but as long as you modify the RGB cable, you could have the sync voltage back down to normal. I think all you need is a 470 ohm resistor on the sync pin of the SCART head, and you could be able to use that the CMVS on SCART equipment safely. Definitely double check before using though. I think Dan, Citrus 3000 PSI, posted tests for that. So I think those are all the different levels of options you can get, from just buying, getting an MVS board with a plexi case and using a super gun. Great solution if you already have a super gun. The CMVS is going to get a decent quality output. Certainly not something you'd be upset about, as long as you make sure that the voltage output's there. And just in my opinion, a lot of the pre-consoleized MVSs are so expensive that you could buy an AES and then spend the money, which the AESs all look pretty, most of them look pretty good out of the box. I remember one revision that's terrible, but with the money it would cost to get some of those expensive pre-consoleized MVSs, you could pick up the AES and then have some of the super duper mods done to it. So yeah, hopefully that kind of covers the spectrum for you, depending on what you were looking to do. My buddy Chris from Belgium, one of the new writers for Retro RGB, has responded to Jens Jacob Christensen's question about a no-cut Sega 32X region mod, and he found a pretty cool link to somebody that has already done it, and it looks like pretty good work. So yeah, thank you very much, Chris, for chiming in, and I will get back to 32X testing probably in a couple weeks. Got to finish up the video first, and then finish Genesis testing. So I'll get to it eventually, and I'm pretty excited to see if there's anything we could do to it. David A has a pretty good question. He said he's building a retro emulation console that he's going to connect to an Amiga CRT, and he's got a RetroTink Ultimate. So I believe that Amiga TV has a VGA style port on it, right? I've never seen one in person, I've never used one, so if I'm wrong then I'm way off. But if that's the case, you should be able to just use a VGA cable from the RetroTink Ultimate right to that, and then not have to worry about anything else. If that's not the case, you might want to look into customizing a cable. You have a link here that talks about it, but without knowing the pinout of the Amiga and without knowing if there's any other requirements, I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on that. But I would just double check the pinouts, and the RetroTink Ultimate's just a good idea for that, because if it is just VGA, even if it's sync through horizontal sync, H-sync, then it should still line up perfectly. Also, the RetroTink has a switch that toggles between RGBS and RGB HV, so that might even be a help as well. You said you already got the Pi to SCART, which is very good, but I don't think that's what you would want to use on this. I think the RetroTink Ultimate is exactly what you would want. So maybe double check the pinouts, but it should just be it could be as easy as just plugging a VGA cable in. Nathan Kimball had a pretty good question. He said that he's using a SNES 1 chip connected to an OSSC with the HD Retrovision component cables, and then the HD Retrovision is going into the 10DAC HDMI to VGA adapter, which is plugged into a VGA monitor. And while that sounds complicated, that's a very, very common setup these days. Essentially, you're using the OSSC as a line doubler, going into a VGA monitor and then adding scan lines, and depending on the monitor you can get a really, really high quality signal that looks close enough to being something like a PVM. The problem he's having is that when you play Top Gear on the SNES, the game will cut out briefly when starting a race or when your opponent enters the pit stop. It seems like the game is changing video modes during these sections. So I don't ever remember playing Top Gear, and if I did, it was on a CRT, but the one thing to test if you have a ROM card is download the free HD Retrovision software or the 240p test suite and toggle between 240p and 480i modes and see if it does the same thing. If it does, then that's what's happening, and there's nothing you can do, unfortunately. And in fact, there's really not a way that you could handle this unless you use one of those devices that that improperly handles 240p as 480i, because the device usually delays between switching. So sorry, I wish there was better news for that, but definitely test to try it out. Nathan Kimball also asked if there's a way to default the OSSC to component input with 56% scan lines. I'm pretty sure if you have the very newest version of the firmware, you can create that as a profile, set it, and set it to boot like that. I'm 99% sure. I could be wrong, but I think you should try that out, because that just using the latest firmware and saving might just solve that problem for you. And Nathan had one last question. Would using the Mister FPGA on his VGA monitor be a good solution or a cost-effective solution for analog NES? Well, so it's a good solution, but I'm not sure if I would buy the Mister and the add-on boards just to play NES at the moment. If you planned on purchasing this with the idea of, hey, I'm going to use it for NES now and then continue to mess with it as things go along, you know, mess with the new cores, maybe see what else they have, then sure, absolutely. I haven't done some serious NES gaming on it yet. You know, I'd love to sit down and play DuckTales all the way through. I still love that game. Or like Mega Man 1 or something like that. But all the people that have used it said it's great. So, you know, I guess if you're only looking to purchase a NES, I don't know if I would jump on the Mister just yet. But if you were looking to buy an analog NES and mess with other stuff, I would say sure, absolutely. And, you know, excuse me, just cross your fingers and hope you don't run into any bugs or anything, but it seems decently stable. And lastly, Kyle Lenhart asked if anyone has a recommendation for a component video splitter. So in the future, so by the end of 2019, the Super G will have the G-Comp switch 8x2 out. So 8 in, 2 outputs, component video supporting 240p all the way up to 1080p, I believe. And it's designed with gaming in mind. So that would be the best solution overall, but that's not available today. So for today, you might consider picking up an Extron Crosspoint switch and just getting some RCA to BNC adapters. The cheap ones are finicky, so if you need 10 by 20 or something like that, or if you need 20 by 40, and they're so cheap though that you wouldn't feel bad throwing them out, and it's very easy to tell if you have a problem. Plug in one console at a time, wiggle the cable. If the colors go out, you know, figure out which color it is, throw that adapter out, plug a new one in. You know, as long as you're not using a scope in testing, it really is that simple. So you could buy 40 of them for 15 bucks and, you know, toss the rest. But that might be it, or, you know, that as a switch, because it has multiple inputs and multiple outputs, might be great for you right now. But if you already have everything set up and you just want a splitter, just jump on eBay and look for any kind of Extron video splitter like that. They might even have VGA ones that you could just use a cheap dongle adapter that's a component video coming out to a VGA head. But Extron should have some equipment that could take care of it either way for now. And I would just plan on in the future aiming to get one of those G-Comp 8x2s because, you know, they're going to be as good or better than the 4x1 that I've tested, which is awesome. So that'll definitely be the one going forward. All right, well, that's it for this week's very well-lit supporter Q&A. I got to go clean up all these lights and all this stuff. Genuinely sorry for all the coughing. I've been doing way better. I managed to make it all day recording and not have too many issues. So I'm still getting over that naggy cold. Really sorry for the annoying coughing. I tried to at least always turn my head away from the mic and cover my mouth. So apologies. And for anybody that's new to any of these subscriber Q&As, whatever questions you have for next week, place them wherever you found this. So Patreon, Subscribestar, I still haven't figured out how to work the YouTube one, so please message me somewhere and let me know if you're subscribing on YouTube. But ask your questions there, because these videos have the comments disabled, because this is supposed to just be a subscriber experience. And then about a month after they air, on a Saturday, I release them to the public, but comments still disabled. So any questions at all, anything you got, fire away. I really love doing these things, and I really appreciate everybody participating and having fun with this stuff. And of course, I appreciate all the support, because none of these videos would happen without any of you. So thank you so much, and I'll see everybody next week.